Okay, when you guys want to make your test bed, the first thing you're going to do is go into Edmodo. Click on 8th grade, click on folders. You're going to go to 8th grade robotics PLTW. There's a bunch of different documents and things you're going to need, but I'm going to point out a couple of them. The first one here is this 8th grade test bed document. This tells you what you have to do and what you have to program your robots or your test bed to do. The first 6 are the ones that are required. So the first thing you need to do is you need to turn on one motor for 3 seconds. Then you need to turn on 2 motors for 5 seconds. Then one motor for 4 seconds with the switch, etc., etc. As soon as you do number 1, turn on one motor for 3 seconds, and you have that accomplished, raise your hand. I'll come over, I will check it out, and I will say yes, good, or no, not good. As soon as you get number 1 done, you move on to number 2. So that's what you need to do. Going back here, a couple more documents that are really good ones to have or look at is the GTT VEX test bed. And this is a PowerPoint. And there's a couple of different pages that I think are really important for you to take note of. The first one would be slide 22. When you go to slide 22, this is what your test bed should look like as it loads here. Basically, your test bed is going to have a Cortex, that is this thing right here. In addition to the Cortex, it's going to have a battery attached to it. The battery doesn't have to be snapped in or put on just like this one. It can be loose, I don't have a problem with that. The batteries are located usually in the front of the room, and the chargers for the batteries are usually by the clock in the classroom on the second shelf. So if you look up there, it says VEX chargers, and you can grab a charger and charge a battery. You have to have a charged battery. The other things you need is you need a motor and a... Sorry about the bell. You need a motor and a second motor. You do not have to have wheels on it, but you have to have something that shows that motion. So if you have a gear on here and a wheel on here, that's fine. Or 2 gears or 2 wheels, it doesn't matter to me. But it just, when the motor turns on, we need to see something spin. You also need this switch here and this switch right here. You do not need this line tracker, and you do not need the potentiometer. You also do not need this claw. So what you do need is the Cortex, the battery, 2 switches, 2 motors, and 2 things attached to the motors. Okay, so once you build that, the next part is how do I program it? And there's a lot of good things in this PowerPoint. It's not a terrible idea to read through this PowerPoint, but I'm going to show you the very first one. So over here you can see robot motion. That's probably a good one to know. Until, wait, and then here's some sample programs. And now we get to what type of motors we have, connecting the motors. And then I like to look at these 2 slides here. Moving motor 2 for 5 seconds. Slide 64 here and 65 show you the basic programming for moving a motor for 5 seconds. Well, if we go back to what do I need to do, the first thing we need to do is move a motor for 3 seconds. So it should be very similar to this. Basically, we are moving a motor for 5 seconds. What this is telling us right here is it says start motor, wait 5 seconds, stop motor. The only difference between ours and this one is we will only do it for 3 seconds on the first one, so it'll be start motor, wait 3 seconds, and then stop motor. This slide also does a nice job of kind of showing you some things. Before I show you how to program it, I'm going to show you one more thing you're going to need. Number 6 says use a while loop to turn 2 motors on and off with a switch. If I go back, not to this page, I'm going to get out of there. If I go back to the 8th grade robotics PLTW folder and I go to while loops PDF, the while loops PDF does a nice job of showing you how to set up a while loop. This is not the program you're going to be using, but this is showing you how to set up your while loop, which is number 6 right here. When you set up your while loop, it should say task main with those 2 brackets, this bracket, while, this whole thing here with the bracket, the 1, a space, a couple equals, and a 1, and another bracket. This bracket, this is where your code goes, and then you need these 2 brackets. The code that you are writing for that one should be how do I turn two motors on and off with a switch? And with a while loop, it'll just, once it goes through this set of programs, it'll go right back to the top and start over. So every time I turn the motors on with a switch, they need to eventually turn off with another switch and then go back to the top of the while loop document here, and then go from there. So that's the general idea of how a while loop works. Moving on then, so we are back here. We need to now know what to do. We know what to do right here. This tells us what to do. But if I was going to now, how do I find the robot C? So I have two robot Cs on my desktop. If you can't find your robot C, you can always come down here and search for it. Look for robot C. You don't want the graphical one. You want the robot C for Vex Robotics. So that's the program you are going to use to program your robots. Okay, so we go here. I don't need to do this. Basically what you're going to do is go to New File. And when you go to New File, it's going to look like this. The first thing you need to do potentially is you are going to go to Robot and download firmware, manually update firmware, master CPU, and standard file. I currently do not have mine hooked up to a Cortex, my computer, so if I hit that, it's going to say no communications link. When you hit that, it will work. Now, you don't have to do that every day, but the first time you do this, you're probably going to want to download some firmware. Once in a while, I would say 5% of the time, you need to update the Robot C firmware and do the same thing we did here with the Master CPU firmware. Now, if something's not working, that's one of the first things I would try is to re-download the firmware and see if that's going to help with your issues. If that doesn't help, it's going to be something else, and you have to kind of mess around with it and find it. But that's one of the first things I would do when I get to start this project. You don't have to do it every day, but the first time I would do it. Okay, so I'm ready to start programming my Cortex. So I go in here to Motors and Sensor Setup, and I always like to just do my motors first. Let's talk about motors. So on your Cortex, there is a side of the Cortex that says Motors, and then there's 10 ports, 1 through 10. If you look at the motor ports, ports 1 and 10 have the ability to plug a 2-prong motor into it. So there's 2 little openings in your Cortex. Ports 2 through 9 have 3-prong motor ports. Well, the motors we use only have 2 prongs. So that would mean we can use port 1 and we can use port 10. If you need to use more than 2 motors, or your motor port 1 or 10 does not work, you can still use ports 2 through 9. You just need to grab a microcontroller from the front of the room where you will plug your 2-prong motor into the 2-prong adapter, and then that adapts to a 3-prong, which allows you to plug into ports 2 through 9. If you have a question on that, see me. Otherwise, you should use ports 1 and 10 and you won't have an issue. When you name your motors, my suggestion is to always name your motors a name, so a human name. So if your name is Robert, Robert's a good name. If you have a second motor, maybe John would be a good name for that. I always like to name them names. You can use your own name, you can use whoever's name. Don't use numbers, don't use right, left, up, down. Use human names. So what motor type do we have? Well, we have 2 types of motors that we use, the VEX 269 and the VEX 393. VEX 269 is the motors we used originally when we bought this program 5 years ago, and all the new motors I bought are 393s. We only have a couple 269s left, so more than likely you're going to click on VEX 393. But the way you check is just look at the motor and it says 393 or 269 right on it. So I'm going to do that for both of these, and that's programming our motors. Now we have 2 different types of sensors. We have digital sensors and we have analog sensors. The digital sensors are the ones we're going to use. Digital is basically, the way that I kind of describe digital is it's either on or it's off. So if you use a light switch at home that's just got the toggle flip on, flip off, the switch is either on or it's off. There's no in between. Analog sensors are like a dimmer switch at home. So if you have a dimmer switch where it makes the light really bright, or a medium or off, that's an analog sensor because there's different variances of on and off. We aren't going to use any analog sensors in this 60 days. When you get to high school, you might be using some analog sensors. So our digital sensor, it doesn't matter which port we put it in. Let's pick digital port 3. Let's name this Bob, short for Robert, right? We used Robert earlier. What type of sensor do we use? I always like to use touch, and then I hit OK. Notice this all popped up here. Do not mess with any of this. Do not mess with this. Do not mess with this, and do not mess with this. Okay, so we want to start a motor for 3 seconds, I believe, and turn it off. So the way I do that is I go to natural language, I go to movement, I click and drag over start motor, then I go to wait, click and drag over wait, and then click and drag over stop motor. I have some things I need to change. So what motor port am I using? Well, let's use port 1. Port 1 is the one that has Robert, so we're going to use that. What speed am I going to use? I'm going to go with 63. The reason for that is the highest rate of speed that I can have is 127. 63 is half speed, so I'm going to use 63. When you build your car or your sign, you're going to use 127. Wait time. Well, this was 3 seconds, I believe. Motor port. Back to port 1. That's how you write the code for the very first one that you're doing. If it's not working, there's a possibility that if you go to robot and you go to platform type, if natural language PLTW is not clicked, this might not be working for you. So make sure you go to platform type and natural language PLTW. If it's not working, go to platform type, click VEX 2.0. Then once you click on that, go back into it and then go to it. I bet you natural language PLTW then shows up. Okay? That's the first coding that you're going to do. That was number 1. Let's say I want to add a switch to this. So at some point you're going to need to add a switch. Well, if I want to use a switch, I go to the until, and I go until touch, and I click and drag that over. In what port did we put that into? I believe we put it into digital 3. So DGTL 3. Or if you want to write Bob in here, you could write Bob and that would work as well. Doesn't matter to me if you use these or the names. Okay, so now this is saying when the button is touched, the motor starts, goes 3 seconds, stops. What if I wanted to start 2 motors? Well, if I want to start 2 motors, I just go over here to start a motor, click and drag it. Let's go with port 10 because that's our other port. 10. Change the speed to 63, and now I'm starting 2 motors. Now, if I want to stop that motor, though, I would need to bring and drag over a stop motor and figure out what port I want to put that into. Oops, 10. So that's how I would. This says now until touch, so when it gets touched, 2 motors will start. We're going to wait 3 seconds. They're going to stop. If we wanted to stop a motor using a touch sensor, I would drop this down to like 0.2, let's say, because we don't really need to wait for anything. And then we go over here to until touch, and now what will happen is the motors are going to start. 3, digital 3. They're going to start, and then they're going to wait for 0.2 seconds, and then they won't stop until you touch that switch again. So that's the general idea of how you program your motors. Once you have something programmed, go to Robot, compile and download, hit save. You can replace that. Mine says VEX link is not available. That's because I don't have my Cortex hooked up. So that's your general how to do this programming. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, good job.